The night Naira Vale was sent away, she didn't scream. She didn't argue. She didn't ask for another chance. She stood at the edge of a long marble driveway with one suitcase beside her, the mansion lights glowing behind her like a world she was no longer allowed to enter. Inside that house were years of shared memories, quiet laughter, whispered promises, mornings that began with warmth instead of silence. And the man who once promised to protect her had agreed to let her go. Not loudly, not cruelly, but quietly, which somehow hurt more. Have you ever loved someone so deeply that you trusted their silence, only to realize, too late, that silence was a decision? What happens when the person who vowed to stand beside you chooses peace over you? When the word family is taken away, not by strangers, but by the people closest to your heart. Tonight's story isn't just about betrayal. It's about love without protection, about loyalty delayed, and about how sometimes being sent away becomes the moment you finally find yourself. If you believe love stories should teach us something real about life, relationships, and self-worth, take a second to subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. These are not just stories to listen to, but stories to feel, remember, and learn from. Now let me take you back to when love was still enough. Long before the mansion, before the boardrooms, before the last name carried weight. Naira Vale grew up in a home where doors were never locked and dinner was never eaten alone. It wasn't a big house, but it was always full of conversation, of laughter, of the kind of warmth that didn't need money to exist. In Naira's world, people showed up for each other. Promises were kept not because they were convenient, but because words mattered. Love wasn't loud. It was steady. She learned early that happiness didn't come from what you owned, but from who sat beside you when the day was done. Rowan Ashford came from a different world entirely. When Naira met him, though, none of that mattered yet. He wasn't a billionaire then. He wasn't even close. He was just a man with ambition in his eyes and exhaustion in his shoulders. A man building something with no guarantee it would succeed. A man who carried pressure quietly and listened more than he spoke. They met during a season when neither of them was looking for forever. Rowan had stopped at a small cafe near a shared workspace, laptop open, mind racing, fingers frozen above the keyboard. Naira noticed the frustration before she noticed him. She offered a smile first, then conversation. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't instant fireworks. It was easy. They talked about work, about dreams, about how strange it felt to want more from life without knowing exactly what more looked like. Rowan was drawn to how present she was. Naira was drawn to how safe he felt, like he wasn't performing, just being. Their relationship unfolded slowly, intentionally. Late evenings turned into long walks. Long walks turned into shared routines. Rowan would talk about the company he was trying to build, his hopes, his fears, the nights he stayed awake wondering if he was chasing something foolish. Naira listened, not to fix him, not to advise him, just to be there. And in a world that constantly demanded something from Rowan, that presence felt like rest. He fell in love with her quietly, with the way she noticed small things, with how she made ordinary moments feel meaningful, with how she never made him feel smaller for not having arrived yet. Nira fell in love with him the same way, with his consistency, with his kindness when no one was watching, with how he reached for her hand in silence, as if words would only get in the way. Their love didn't rush. It built itself brick by brick. Trust, laughter, vulnerability, shared struggle. When Rowan finally asked Nira to marry him, it wasn't planned for an audience. It happened on a rainy night in their small apartment, the windows fogged from the storm outside, the room filled with that calm hush rain brings when the world slows down. Rowan didn't kneel dramatically. His voice shook. His hands weren't steady. He told her he couldn't promise perfection. He couldn't promise ease, but he promised presence. "I will choose you," he said, "every day, even when it's hard." Nira didn't hesitate. She said yes, because she believed him. And for a while, he meant it. Their marriage began simply. They learned each other in the quiet ways that matter most. How Rowan took his coffee, how Nira needed silence in the morning, how arguments ended faster when pride stayed out of the room. They were a team. But love stories don't change, because love disappears. They change when pressure arrives. As Rowan's company began to grow, so did the demands on him. Meetings stretched late. Responsibilities multiplied. Success, once a distant goal, started knocking loudly. Nira supported him without complaint. She believed in his vision. She celebrated every milestone like it was her own. But success has a way of inviting voices that were never there at the beginning. Rowan's mother, Celeste Ashford, entered their marriage not with anger, but with authority. She carried herself like someone used to being obeyed. Her words were measured, her smiles controlled. She came from a world where family names opened doors, and appearances were as valuable as loyalty. From the moment she met Nira, something was off. Celeste was polite, but distant, complimentary, but cold. Every interaction felt like an evaluation, rather than a welcome. Nira noticed it immediately, that quiet sense of being tolerated, not accepted. Rowan dismissed it at first. "She'll come around," he said. "She just needs time." Nira believed him. Love makes believers of us all. What Nira didn't know, what she couldn't see yet, was that love unprotected doesn't fail all at once. It fades, slowly, silently, while everyone pretends nothing is wrong. And by the time you realize what's happening, the decision has already been made. In the early years of their marriage, Nira still believed that love, when nurtured, could outgrow any shadow. Rowan's workdays became longer, but his presence, when he was home, still felt genuine. He made an effort in small, meaningful ways, leaving notes on the counter before early meetings, calling during lunch just to hear her voice, sitting beside her late at night, shoes kicked off, tie loosened, resting his head against her shoulder as if the world finally stopped asking him for answers. Those moments mattered. They were reminders that underneath the ambition and exhaustion, the man she married was still there. Naira learned to adapt. She always had. She filled her days with purpose, volunteering, reading, building routines that didn't depend on Rowan's schedule. She didn't resent his drive. She admired it. She believed marriage was about seasons, and this was simply one of them. What she didn't realize was that while Rowan was learning how to manage success, she was quietly learning how to be alone inside a relationship. Celeste Ashford became more present as Rowan became more absent. Her visits were frequent, always framed as concern. She would inspect the home with careful eyes, comment on decor choices, ask pointed questions about Naira's plans, her ambitions, her contributions. Never openly unkind, never openly warm. "You must find it strange," Celeste once said lightly, sipping her tea, to marry into a family with expectations. Naira smiled politely. Every family has expectations. Celeste's lips curved, some more than others. It was subtle, almost nothing, but Naira felt it linger long after Celeste left. Rowan noticed pieces of it, enough to feel discomfort, not enough to confront it. When Naira mentioned feeling out of place, he reassured her with soft words and tired smiles. "You're overthinking," he'd say. "She doesn't mean anything by it." Naira wanted to believe that, so she stopped mentioning it. That was the first lesson she learned without realizing it. When your discomfort is repeatedly softened instead of addressed, it teaches you to minimize yourself. Still, love found its way through the cracks. On rare weekends without meetings, Rowan would suggest spontaneous trips, quiet places by the water, long drives where music filled the silence. Those trips reminded Naira of who they were before life accelerated. They would talk about the future again, about children, about slowing down someday, about a home that felt less like a showroom and more like a place people lived in. Rowan would hold her face gently and say, "I won't lose us." Naira believed him because love, when sincere, sounds convincing. But success doesn't only bring opportunity. It brings influence, and influence rarely travels alone. Celeste's involvement in Rowan's life expanded beyond family matters. She offered advice on business connections, social appearances, the importance of aligning with the right people. Rowan listened, not because he agreed with everything she said, but because she spoke the language of the world he was entering. Naira noticed the shift in conversations. They no longer talked only about feelings or dreams. They talked about optics, about timing, about perception. Words like appropriate, strategic, necessary began replacing happy, peaceful, together. None of it happened overnight. It never does. The emotional distance arrived quietly, disguised as maturity. Naira began to sense she was no longer Rowan's refuge, but another responsibility he tried to manage carefully. He still loved her. She could feel that. But love without priority starts to feel conditional. There were nights Rowan came home late, drained beyond conversation. Naira would sit beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, not wanting to ask questions that felt like demands. She learned the rhythm of his exhaustion, learned when to speak, and when silence felt safer. What she didn't know was that silence, when practiced too often, becomes a habit. And habits shape outcomes. Celeste watched all of this unfold with patience. She never rushed. She never pushed openly. She simply observed where Rowan hesitated and leaned into those moments. One evening, after a formal event Rowan attended alone, Celeste spoke carefully. "Naira is kind," she said. "But kindness isn't always enough in our world." Rowan didn't argue. He didn't agree either. He simply didn't respond. Naira felt the consequences of that silence weeks later. Invitations began arriving with her name missing. Family gatherings were scheduled around Rowan's availability, not theirs. Decisions were made and communicated afterward. Naira wasn't excluded aggressively. She was excluded efficiently. She still tried. She dressed carefully for family events, chose her words thoughtfully, smiled when her chest felt tight. She told herself she was being patient, understanding, mature. But patience without boundaries slowly becomes self-erasure. The turning point of the chapter didn't come with a fight. It came with an ordinary moment. One evening, Rowan returned home early for once. Naira was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, humming softly. He stood watching her for a moment, something heavy behind his eyes. "You've been quiet lately," he said. Naira paused. "So, have you—" They shared a small smile, the kind that tries to bridge distance without naming it. "I'm just tired," Rowan said. "Everything feels complicated." Naira turned toward him. "We don't have to be—" He hesitated. That hesitation said more than words ever could. Naira understood something then. Not fully, but enough to feel afraid. Love was still there, but protection wasn't. Love without protection is fragile. She didn't say anything at night. She finished dinner. They ate together. They laughed softly. They held hands before sleep. But Naira lay awake long after Rowan drifted off, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet. Not peaceful quiet, uncertain quiet. She didn't know yet that this was the beginning of the shift, the point where love stopped being enough on its own, where loyalty would soon be tested not by loud conflict, but by quiet agreement, and where the word family would begin to mean something very different than she had ever imagined. If this chapter made you feel something, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who believes love should be protected, and subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson for stories that don't just entertain, but teach real-life lessons. Naira didn't wake up one morning feeling unwanted. It crept in slowly, through pauses that lasted a second too long, through decisions made without her, through conversations that stopped when she entered the room. It wasn't cruelty. It was omission. And omission has a way of teaching people exactly where they stand. The Ashford name began opening doors Rowan had once only imagined. Invitations arrived, embossed and formal. Events required preparation, polish, and presence. Rowan moved through those spaces with growing confidence, learning how to speak less and observe more, how to command attention without raising his voice. Naira walked beside him, smiling when expected, listening carefully, absorbing a world that spoke a different language than the one she grew up in. This world valued impressions over intentions. At the first formal gathering she attended as Rowan's wife, Naira realized something important. People didn't ask who she was. They asked what she represented. Their eyes lingered, not with curiosity, but assessment. Celeste stood nearby that night, effortlessly in control, introducing Rowan to influential faces. When Naira was mentioned, it was briefly. "My son's wife," Celeste would say, already turning to the next conversation. Naira stayed gracious. She always did. She learned quickly when to speak and when to remain quiet. She learned that some rooms rewarded presence, not personality. Still, she believed patience would earn respect over time. That belief carried her through moments that felt small, but accumulated quietly. Celeste's influence extended into the private corners of Rowan's life. She suggested advisors, guided social connections, reminded him of the importance of appearing united with the right people. Rowan listened, telling himself it was temporary, just until things stabilized. Naira noticed the change in how Rowan spoke. His sentences grew measured. His emotions filtered. He weighed responses the way he once weighed risks in business. Even at home, conversations began to feel rehearsed, not dishonest, just careful. There were still tender moments, mornings when Rowan kissed her forehead before leaving, evenings when he rested his head against her shoulder without speaking. Those moments reassured Naira that love hadn't disappeared. But love alone doesn't prevent erosion. Celeste began inviting Naira to lunches and teas, private, controlled environments where tone mattered more than truth. The conversations always circled the same themes: legacy, image, sacrifice. Marriage into a family like ours requires adaptability, Celeste said once, her voice calm. Not everyone manages it well. Naira nodded, unsure whether it was advice or warning. You're fortunate, Celeste continued. Rowan has always been generous with his heart. Naira felt the implication immediately. Generosity could be withdrawn. Rowan wasn't present for these conversations. Celeste preferred it that way, and Naira, still believing patience was strength, didn't tell him everything. She filtered her discomfort the same way he filtered his stress. That mutual protection unspoken and well-intentioned, slowly created distance instead of closeness. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Rowan arrived home visibly tense. Naira greeted him with a warm smile, but he barely noticed. His phone buzzed constantly. His attention remained split. "I'm thinking of restructuring my schedule," he said distractedly. "There are expectations now." Naira hesitated. Expectations from who? Rowan paused. From everyone. That answer unsettled her more than he realized. As weeks passed, Celeste's presence felt less like support and more like authority. Decisions were made and presented as conclusions, not discussions. Rowan accepted them with nods and brief acknowledgments. Naira watched him adapt, not out of arrogance, but out of survival in a world that rewarded compliance with access. She wondered when adaptation became compromise. At another family gathering, Naira overheard a conversation she wasn't meant to hear. "She's lovely," someone said softly. "Yes," Celeste replied, "but loveliness doesn't always translate." Naira stood frozen behind a column, unseen. The words weren't loud. They weren't harsh. They were dismissive. She understood then that no amount of kindness would change a narrative already written about her. That night, as they drove home, Naira stared out the window, the city lights blurring past. Rowan noticed her silence. "You okay?" he asked. Naira considered telling him everything. Every comment, every glance, every moment. She felt reduced to an accessory in someone else's life. "Instead," she said, "I'm just tired." Rowan nodded, accepting the answer gratefully. And in that moment, something important went unsaid. Education doesn't always come from instruction. Sometimes it comes from experience, learning that unspoken truths don't disappear. They wait. Naira didn't yet know that the world she married into had rules she was never meant to write, only follow. By the time Naira fully understood the rules of the Ashford world, she realized no one had ever asked whether she agreed to them. They simply expected her to adapt. The first clear sign came during a discussion that wasn't meant to feel important. Rowan mentioned, almost casually, that Celeste had arranged a weekend retreat for the family and a few business associates. "It'll be good for visibility," he said, loosening his tie. "Just a small gathering." Naira smiled. "That sounds nice." Rowan hesitated, then added, "You won't need to come for all of it. Some parts are formal." The words were gentle. The meaning was not. Naira felt the pause stretch between them. "Formal how?" Rowan avoided her eyes. "It's just easier if I handle those moments." "Beer!" That word settled heavily in Naira's chest. She nodded anyway. That night, lying beside Rowan, Naira stared at the ceiling again, the pattern becoming familiar. She told herself it was temporary. That compromise was part of marriage. That love sometimes required flexibility. But compromise without mutual sacrifice is not compromise at all. The retreat came and went. Rowan returned with stories about connections made, expectations clarified, paths smoothed. Celeste was pleased. Oh, made sure Naira knew it. You were wise to stay away, Celeste said lightly during tea. Some environments are demanding. Nira smiled, though something inside her tightened. She began noticing how often Celeste spoke for Rowan, how she framed decisions as inevitabilities rather than choices, and Rowan, whether from exhaustion or trust, allowed it. Nira tried, once more, to speak up. I feel like I'm being slowly removed, she said quietly one evening. Rowan frowned, confused. Removed from what? From us, Naira replied. Rowan reached for her hand. You're reading too much into things. The words weren't unkind, but they closed the door on the conversation. And Naira learned another lesson. When concerns are consistently minimized, people stop raising them. Celeste's involvement intensified. She offered opinions on Naira's clothing for events, her seating arrangements, even the timing of her appearances, always framed as guidance, always justified as necessity. Perception matters, Celeste would say. You must understand that. Nira understood more than Celeste realized. She understood that she was being shaped into something acceptable, or eased out entirely. What hurt most wasn't Celeste's control. It was Rowan's quiet compliance. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't unfaithful. He wasn't openly dismissive. He was absent in the moments that required protection. Romantic moments still existed, but they felt fragile now, like borrowed time rather than foundation. Rowan would hold her at night, whisper apologies for his schedule, promise things would slow down. Naira believed him less each time. The emotional intimacy they once shared had thinned. Conversations avoided depth. Discomfort was smoothed over rather than explored. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner with Celeste and extended family, Nira excused herself early. She stood alone on the balcony, breathing in the cool air, grounding herself. Rowan joined her minutes later. She didn't mean anything by it, he said, before Naira spoke. Naira turned slowly. That's what you always say. Rowan sighed. What do you want me to do? Nira looked at him then, not angrily, not accusingly, but honestly. I want you to stand with me, she said, even when it's uncomfortable. Rowan hesitated. That hesitation was everything. It wasn't refusal. It wasn't agreement. It uncertainty. And uncertainty, in moments like this, feels like abandonment. Naira realized something important that night. Love that isn't defended eventually feels conditional, and conditional love forces people to perform instead of belong. Celeste noticed the shift in Nira as well. She became less warm, less accommodating, more reserved, more observant. Strength, when it arrives quietly, unsettles people who rely on control. "You seem distant," Celeste remarked one afternoon. Nira met her gaze evenly. "I'm learning." Celeste smiled thinly. "Be careful what you learn." But Nira wasn't afraid anymore. What frightened her was not Celeste's authority, but Rowan's indecision. Education doesn't always come from advice. Sometimes it comes from pain that teaches you what love requires. Naira was learning that love, without advocacy, becomes fragile. That silence, when repeated, teaches others how to treat you. And she was beginning to understand something she had never wanted to face. If the moment came where she needed Rowan to choose, he might not. The world she married into wasn't just unfamiliar. It was preparing to test her place in it. Success didn't announce itself loudly in Rowan's life. It arrived disguised as progress. At first, it was a new office, then a larger team, then meetings that required travel, presentations that demanded preparation, decisions that carried weight far beyond personal comfort. Rowan adapted quickly. He always had. Naira watched him change in subtle ways, not in character, but in rhythm. His mornings became rushed, his evenings uncertain. Conversations shortened to updates instead of connection. When he was home, his mind was often elsewhere, sorting through problems no one else could see. Nira tried to meet him where he was. She adjusted her schedule, planned dinners later, learned to recognize the sound of exhaustion in his voice. She stopped asking how long meetings would last and started asking whether he'd eaten. It wasn't sacrifice she resented. It was invisibility. As Rowan's success grew, the world around him became louder, and Naira's presence became quieter within it. Not because she mattered less to him, but because his attention was constantly being pulled outward. And attention, once divided too many ways, becomes diluted. Celeste noticed Rowan's growing influence immediately. She took pride in his achievements, speaking of him as if he were a reflection of her own foresight. She positioned herself closer, offering guidance, protection, and connections. Rowan appreciated it. He needed it. Naira recognized the pattern forming. Celeste was becoming a constant voice in Rowan's decisions, not demanding, but persuasive, not commanding, but certain. Certainty carries power. One evening, Rowan came home later than usual. Naira had left dinner warming in the oven. She didn't ask where he'd been. She could see it in his posture, the weight of expectation pressing down. He loosened his tie and leaned against the counter, eyes closed. "I don't know how to make everyone happy," he said quietly. Nira moved closer, resting her hand against his chest. "You don't have to," Rowan exhaled slowly. "It feels like I do." That sentence lingered between them. Naira realized then that Rowan was beginning to confuse responsibility with obligation. And obligation, when left unchecked, often pushes aside what matters most. She tried to remind him, gently, of their center. They still shared moments of closeness. Mornings when Rowan lingered a second longer before leaving. Nights when he reached for her in his sleep, as if grounding himself. But emotional intimacy requires more than proximity. It requires presence, and presence was becoming rare. Celeste's expectations became clearer as Rowan's role expanded. Family gatherings were now strategic events. Conversations were measured. Appearances were curated. Naira found herself observing more than participating. At one gathering, she sat beside Rowan while Celeste discussed future plans for the family name, partnerships, social commitments, legacy considerations. Naira wasn't asked for her thoughts. Rowan didn't notice. Later that night, Naira asked quietly, "Did you realize I didn't say a single word?" Rowan looked surprised. "You seemed fine." That answer hurt more than indifference would have. Naira began to understand how easily people mistake silence for agreement. Education often comes disguised as discomfort. She started paying attention to how often she swallowed her feelings to maintain peace. How often Rowan chose ease over engagement. How often Celeste filled space no one challenged. This wasn't a failure of love. It was a failure of protection. Rowan still loved Naira. That much was clear, but love without advocacy begins to feel like affection without safety. And safety is what allows love to thrive. The chapter closed, not with confrontation, but with realization. Naira saw that success hadn't made Rowan cruel. It had made him careful, and careful people, when afraid of conflict, sometimes choose silence over loyalty. That understanding settled quietly, but firmly, in Naira's heart. And once learned, it couldn't be unlearned. The first thing Naira lost wasn't love. It was certainty. She used to be certain that if something felt wrong, Rowan would notice. That if a line was crossed, he would step in without being asked. That whatever pressures came with success, their marriage would remain the place where honesty lived freely. Now, certainty felt like a memory instead of a promise. Rowan's schedule tightened further. Days blurred into weeks, marked by travel bags, half unpacked, and conversations paused mid-thought. Naira stopped counting how many dinners cooled, untouched on the table. She learned instead to read the signs, how Rowan's shoulders carried tension, how his replies came a second too late, how his apologies felt sincere but unfinished. "I'll make it up to you," he would say. Naira stopped asking how. Celeste's presence, meanwhile, felt constant. She no longer asked for permission to advise. She assumed it. She spoke about Rowan's future as if it were already decided, about family expectations as if they were laws rather than traditions. Naira noticed how Rowan listened, not skeptically, not defensively, but thoughtfully. One afternoon, while Rowan was away, Celeste visited unannounced. She moved through the house as though it were her own, settling into the living room with practiced ease. "You seem tired," Celeste observed. Nira smiled faintly. "Life has seasons," Celeste nodded. "Some seasons require sacrifice." The word settled heavily between them. Sacrifice from who? Nira asked gently. Celeste's gaze sharpened just slightly. "Those who benefit the most." Nira understood then that Celeste saw the marriage as an arrangement, one that needed adjusting as circumstances changed. What unsettled her wasn't the implication. It was how reasonable Celeste sounded. When Rowan returned later that evening, Nira told him about the visit. Not accusatory, not emotional, just factual. "She thinks sacrifices are necessary," Nira said. Rowan rubbed his temple. "She's just thinking long term." "And what about us?" Nira asked. Rowan hesitated. That pause, brief, almost imperceptible, was louder than any argument. "I'm doing my best," he said finally. Nira nodded, though something inside her shifted. She wasn't questioning his effort. She was questioning his priorities. Their romantic moments became fewer, but more intense. Like they both sensed time slipping. Rowan would hold her close at night, whispering reassurances, tracing familiar lines along her arm. Nira let herself lean into those moments. She needed them, but intimacy built on uncertainty feels fragile. Like holding something beautiful that might slip through your hands. Education often arrives through repetition. Nira noticed the pattern now. Discomfort arose, silence followed, and the issue remained unresolved. Peace was preserved, but at the cost of connection. At a formal event weeks later, Nira stood beside Rowan as Celeste introduced him to influential guests. Again, Nira's presence was acknowledged briefly, then bypassed. "She's lovely," someone said. Rowan smiled politely. He didn't say more. Nira realized then that silence wasn't neutral. It shaped perception. On the drive home, Nira finally spoke. "I need to know something," she said calmly. Rowan glanced at her. "What is it?" "If it ever comes down to choosing between keeping peace and protecting me, what will you do?" The car felt suddenly too quiet. Rowan didn't answer immediately. "I hope it never comes to that," he said. "Hope, not certainty." Nira turned to look out the window, the city lights reflecting faintly in the glass. She understood the answer for what it was: avoidance. And avoidance, when practiced long enough, becomes agreement. That night, Nira lay awake beside Rowan again, listening to his steady breathing. She thought about how love had once felt like safety, how now it felt like something she had to maintain carefully, quietly, without asking too much. She wasn't angry. She was learning that love needs advocacy. That silence teaches people what you'll tolerate. That success tests not just ambition, but loyalty. And she sensed, with a clarity that frightened her, that the true test was still ahead. Because if Rowan could not choose her in small moments, what would happen when the choice became impossible to ignore? Nira didn't ask for much. That was something everyone seemed to misunderstand. She didn't ask Rowan to stop building his future. She didn't ask Celeste to change who she was. She didn't ask the Ashford world to bend itself into something comfortable. She only wanted to feel like she belonged. Instead, she felt like she was constantly being evaluated, quietly, professionally, and without appeal. The more Nira tried to adapt, the more she realized adaptation was never the goal. Compliance was. At family gatherings, she noticed how conversations flowed around her instead of through her. She was present, but rarely included. When she offered opinions, they were acknowledged politely, then set aside. No one disagreed with her. They simply moved on. Rowan rarely noticed. When he did, he interpreted it as neutrality, not dismissal. "They're just reserved," he said once. "That's how they are." Nira nodded, though she knew better. Reserved people still make space for what they value. Celeste's influence was now embedded in the household routines. She suggested changes to schedules, recommended social obligations, and subtly questioned Nira's usefulness in Rowan's expanding world. "You have a kind heart," Celeste told her one afternoon. "But kindness isn't always strategic." Nira smiled politely. She was learning that strategic often meant controllable. The more Celeste spoke, the more Nira understood she was being reduced to a role that could be replaced. Romantic intimacy between Nira and Rowan still existed, but it felt increasingly fragile. Rowan was physically present when he could be, but emotionally preoccupied. When Nira reached for conversation, Rowan often responded with reassurance instead of engagement. "You're overthinking," he'd say. "It's just a phase. Things will settle down." Those phrases softened concern without resolving it. Education doesn't always come from instruction. Sometimes it comes from realizing which conversations are repeatedly avoided. Nira began to feel small in ways she hadn't before. Not weak, but minimized. She adjusted herself unconsciously, lowered expectations, shortened conversations, chose silence where honesty might create discomfort. She told herself she was being understanding, but understanding, when unreciprocated, slowly erodes self-worth. One evening, after a particularly formal event, Nira stood in front of the bathroom mirror, studying her reflection. She looked composed, polished, acceptable, and completely disconnected from who she used to be. She missed the woman who laughed freely, the woman who spoke without rehearsing, the woman who believed love would always protect her. That belief was fading. Rowan came home later that night, exhausted but relieved to be back. He kissed Nira's cheek and leaned into her, seeking comfort without offering it. Naira held him. She still loved him, but love, she was learning, wasn't enough to guarantee safety. Celeste watched Nira carefully now, not with hostility, but with calculation. She noticed Naira's quiet strength, her restraint, her refusal to react emotionally. That kind of composure unsettled people who relied on control. "You're changing," Celeste remarked one day. Nira met her gaze calmly. "So is everything else." Celeste smiled faintly. "Change must be managed." Nira understood the warning. She also understood something deeper. Belonging isn't earned by disappearing. And in trying to fit into a world that didn't want her presence, only her compliance, Naira was losing pieces of herself. The lesson was becoming clearer. Being tolerated feels like acceptance until the moment you need support. And Nira was beginning to sense that moment was coming. Naira stopped explaining herself long before anyone noticed she had. That was the quietest change of all. She no longer corrected assumptions or filled awkward silences. When plans were made without her, she accepted the explanations offered. When her absence was framed as convenience, she smiled and adjusted. She was learning the rules, but learning the rules didn't mean agreeing with them. Rowan noticed the shift only in fragments. How Nira spoke less, how she didn't push for answers, how her questions softened into statements. He mistook her restraint for understanding. He didn't see the cost. Their moments of intimacy became islands instead of foundations. When Rowan reached for her at night, Naira responded, but something in her remained guarded. She was still present, but less vulnerable. Vulnerability requires safety, and safety had become uncertain. Celeste's influence now extended into areas that once felt private. She commented on Naira's schedule, her interests, even her energy. "You seem distracted lately," Celeste observed one afternoon. "Perhaps you should focus more on supporting Rowan." Nira smiled faintly. "I always have." Celeste's eyes lingered. "Support looks different at this level." Naira understood the message. Visibility mattered more than authenticity. That evening, Naira tried once more to speak honestly with Rowan. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just truthfully. "I don't feel like I belong anymore," she said quietly. Rowan sighed. "You belong with me." Nira searched his face. "Then why does it feel like I'm always on the outside?" Rowan hesitated. "You're taking things personally." That was the moment Nira realized something painful. He wasn't hearing her, not because he didn't care, but because acknowledging her pain would require him to confront the very dynamics he was benefiting from. Education often comes when denial stops working. Naira began to detach, not out of bitterness, but out of preservation. She spent more time alone, rediscovering routines that grounded her. Reading, walking, sitting in silence, without trying to fill it. She was reclaiming small pieces of herself. Celeste noticed and adjusted her approach. She became less overt, more patient. Control doesn't always need pressure. Sometimes it thrives on inevitability. At a family dinner, weeks later, Celeste spoke calmly. I think it's important we address expectations, she said. Certain roles need clarity. Naira felt the room grow still. Celeste's gaze rested on her, not hostile, but decisive. Family must be aligned, Celeste continued, and alignment sometimes requires difficult choices. Rowan shifted uncomfortably. He didn't interrupt. Naira understood then that the conversation wasn't about roles. It was about removal. Later that night, Naira stood alone on the balcony again, the familiar place of reflection. Rowan joined her, concern etched into his face. You okay? He asked. Naira looked at him, really looked at him. I don't think you realize how close we are to losing something important, she said. Rowan frowned. You're overthinking that phrase again. Naira nodded slowly. She wasn't overthinking. She was finally seeing clearly. Being tolerated had never been acceptance. It was a temporary allowance, one that could be revoked the moment she became inconvenient. And Rowan, for all his love, had not yet chosen to protect her place. Naira went to bed that night, knowing something had shifted permanently. She didn't know when the final line would be drawn, but she knew she was standing dangerously close to it. The invitation arrived without warmth. It was phrased politely, almost kindly, but Naira felt the weight of it the moment she read the message. Celeste wanted to have dinner. Just the two of them. Rowan would be away on business. Family should spend time together, Celeste had said. Naira read the words twice, then set her phone down and stared at the quiet room around her. Something in her chest tightened. Not fear, exactly, but recognition. This wasn't reconciliation. It was evaluation. Still, Naira accepted. She told herself that avoiding the moment wouldn't change its outcome. That clarity, even when painful, was better than uncertainty. On the evening of the dinner, Naira chose her dress carefully, not to impress, but to remain herself. Simple, elegant, the kind Rowan once loved. She let her hair fall naturally, resisting the urge to overthink. The Ashford estate felt colder than usual. The staff greeted her respectfully, but without familiarity. She noticed the absence of Rowan immediately. How the house felt more formal, less forgiving. Celeste waited in the dining room, posture composed, expression neutral. The table was set precisely, candles lit without warmth. They exchanged pleasantries. Small talk filled the space where honesty would soon arrive. Celeste spoke first. I appreciate you coming, she said calmly. I think it's important we speak openly. Naira nodded. Dinner was served. The clink of cutlery echoed louder than necessary. Celeste spoke about the family, about legacy, about the importance of cohesion. Her voice never rose. She didn't rush. Control, Naira realized, didn't require force. As the meal progressed, the air thickened with unspoken intention. Naira listened. Her posture relaxed, but alert. She felt strangely calm, as if some part of her had been preparing for this moment long before it arrived. Finally, Celeste set her napkin down. "I've given this a great deal of thought," she said, "and I believe it's time we acknowledged reality." Nira's hands stilled. "You are a kind woman," Celeste continued, "but kindness alone does not make someone family." The words landed with precision. Na shouted, "Not cruel, just final." Nira felt her breath catch, but she remained composed. "I don't believe family is defined that way," she said quietly. Celeste regarded her evenly. "In our world, it is." Nira swallowed. "And Rowan." Celeste's gaze didn't waver. "Rowan understands." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Naira felt the shift, the moment when hope loosened its grip. "You're no longer family," Celeste said, "and it's best we stop pretending otherwise." Silence followed. It wasn't empty, it heavy. Nira stood slowly, her movements measured. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. "I see," she said. She left the table untouched, her appetite gone, her heart pounding louder with every step away. As she walked out of the estate, the night air felt sharp against her skin. She called Rowan once. No answer. She called again. Nothing. Nira sat in her car for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing through the realization that something irreversible had just occurred. The lesson was immediate and unmistakable. When people decide you no longer belong, they rarely ask for your agreement. Naira didn't drive away immediately. She sat in the car with the engine off, the estate lights glowing faintly in the distance, her hands resting on the steering wheel as if grounding herself to something real. Her reflection stared back at her from the windshield, composed, controlled, almost unfamiliar. She replayed the words again. "You're no longer family." Not shouted, not argued, declared. She called Rowan again. This time, the call went through, but only to his voicemail. Nira closed her eyes. She wasn't asking him to fix anything. She just needed to hear his voice, to know she wasn't standing alone in this moment. She left a message she would later regret for its restraint. "Your mother said I'm no longer family," she said softly. "Please call me." She started the car and drove home in silence. The house felt hollow when she arrived. Not empty, hollow, as if the walls themselves had been listening and decided to withhold comfort. Naira moved through the rooms slowly, touching familiar surfaces, noticing how easily a life could feel temporary. She waited. Hours passed. Rowan finally called close to midnight. His voice was tired, distracted, somewhere far from where she was standing. "She told me you had dinner," he said. Nira leaned against the counter, steadying herself. "She told me I'm no longer family." There was a pause. Not disbelief, not outrage. A pause. "I thought she might say something like that," Rowan replied. The words struck harder than the statement itself. "You knew?" Nira asked. Rowan exhaled. "She's worried about alignment, about pressure, about how things look." "And you?" Nira asked quietly. "What are you worried about?" Another pause. "Things are complicated right now," he said. "Maybe some distance would help. Just for now." Distance. Nira felt something inside her finally give way, not in anger, but in understanding. "Oh, agree?" she asked. Rowan didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He said nothing. Silence answered for him. Nira nodded slowly, though he couldn't see it. "I understand." They ended the call without resolution, without reassurance, without protection. That night, Nira didn't cry. She packed, not panic, not in desperation. With clarity, one suitcase, only essentials. She moved through the bedroom quietly, folding clothes that still carried Rowan's scent. She left behind the things that belonged to the life she was no longer part of. In the early morning hours, Rowan sent a message. "I've arranged a place for you, just until things settle." Nira stared at the screen. Settling, she realized, meant waiting. Waiting meant hoping. And hope, in this situation, would cost her dignity. She replied with a single word. "Okay." The driver arrived just after sunrise. Nira stood at the door with her suitcase, taking one last look at the space she had tried so hard to belong in. No one stopped her. No one asked her to stay. The lesson was sharp and immediate. Sometimes the most painful betrayals don't come from cruelty, but from agreement disguised as peace. As the car pulled away, Nira pressed her forehead to the window, watching the estate disappear behind her. She felt grief, yes, but beneath it, something unexpected. Relief, because uncertainty was over, and certainty, no matter how painful, was finally hers. If this chapter hit you hard, you're not alone. Like this video, share it with someone who understands what silent betrayal feels like, and subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson for stories that reveal the truth behind love, loyalty, and self-worth. The place Rowan arranged for Nira was quiet. Too quiet. It was a furnished apartment on the edge of the city, clean and neutral, with windows that overlooked streets filled with people who didn't know her story. The furniture looked chosen for convenience, not comfort. Nothing carried memory. Nira stood just inside the door with her suitcase still closed, taking in the unfamiliar space. This, where she was meant to wait, where she was meant to remain patient until things settled. She set the suitcase down and sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap. For the first time since leaving the estate. Her composure wavered, not in tears, to stillness. She realized then how exhausting it had been to hold herself together for so long. Naira moved through the apartment slowly, opening cabinets, touching surfaces, grounding herself. She made tea she didn't drink, sat by the window she didn't look through. Time stretched in unfamiliar ways. No one told her what she was allowed to feel. That was both freeing and terrifying. Rowan didn't call that day. Nira didn't call him either. She wasn't playing a game. She was learning what silence felt like when it wasn't chosen, but imposed. The first night, sleep came late. Naira lay awake, listening to sounds she didn't recognize, replaying moments she wished she'd handled differently. Not with anger, but with clarity. She wondered when she had stopped asking for protection and started settling for reassurance. Education often comes wrapped in discomfort. The next morning, Nira woke early. She dressed simply and stepped outside, letting the cool air fill her lungs. The city felt indifferent, and somehow that helped. No one here expected anything from her. She walked for hours without direction, noticing details she'd ignored for years. Small cafes, quiet parks, people moving through their lives with quiet purpose. For the first time in a long while, Naira felt anonymous, and anonymity felt like relief. Rowan sent a message in the afternoon. "I hope you're okay." Nira read it without reacting. The words felt careful, non-committal. They didn't ask how she felt. They didn't acknowledge what had been taken from her. She didn't reply. That night, Nira sat at the small dining table and wrote, not to Rowan, to herself. She wrote about the woman she used to be, about the choices she made to preserve peace, about the moments she felt invisible, but stayed silent anyway. Writing turned pain into clarity. She realized something important. She had been loyal to a marriage that did not defend her place in it. And loyalty, when one-sided, becomes self-betrayal. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Naira found comfort in routine. Morning walks, simple meals, long evenings without interruption. Didn't rush healing. She let it arrive when it was ready. Rowan called again, days later. "I'm trying to fix things," he said. "Just give it time." Nira listened carefully. Time, she realized, was being used as a substitute for action. "I've given a lot of time already," she said calmly. Rowan didn't know how to respond. That silence, this time, was hers. She ended the call gently. For the first time since she left, Naira felt something shift inside her. Not bitterness. Strength. Being sent away had stripped her life down to essentials. And what remained was herself. The hardest part wasn't being alone. It was realizing how long she had already been. Naira began to notice the small freedoms first. The absence of expectation, the quiet mornings where no one evaluated her choices or measured her usefulness. She could wake when she wanted, eat what she liked, wear clothes that felt like her, not like a role. At first, the freedom felt unfamiliar, almost undeserved. Then it felt necessary. She started spending time in a nearby community space, a modest place with bookshelves, plants, and people who gathered simply because they wanted to be around others. No last names, no reputations, just conversations. No one asked who she was married to. They asked what she liked. That question stayed with her. Naira realized how rarely she had been asked that in recent years. Rowan checked in periodically. His messages were careful, his tone measured. He spoke of conversations he was having, tensions he was managing, plans he was considering. He never spoke of choosing. Naira stopped expecting him to. She noticed how calm she felt after ending their calls. Not relieved, just steady, as if her nervous system was finally resting. Education often comes when patterns repeat clearly enough to be undeniable. Naira understood now that waiting had been framed as patience, but patience without direction is stagnation. And stagnation slowly convinces people they don't deserve more. She refused that lesson. One afternoon, she ran into an old acquaintance, someone from before her marriage, before wealth complicated things. They spoke easily, warmly. He commented on how peaceful she seemed. "I had to lose some noise to hear myself again," Naira replied, without thinking. The words surprised her with their truth. That evening, Naira returned to the apartment and stood by the window as the sun dipped below the skyline. She thought about how easily her life had been moved, packed into a suitcase, relocated with minimal resistance. Not because she lacked strength, but because she had been taught not to use it. She picked up her phone and reread Rowan's last message. "I'm doing everything I can," Naira typed, then erased several responses. Finally, she wrote, "I need more than effort. I need clarity." She sent it before doubt could interfere. Rowan didn't reply immediately, and for once, the delay didn't unsettle her. Days passed. Naira continued building a life that didn't revolve around waiting. She volunteered again, reconnecting with the parts of herself that found purpose in giving, not performing. She laughed more, slept better, breathed deeper. She felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Grounded. When Rowan finally called, his voice carried uncertainty. "I don't want to lose you," he said. Naira closed her eyes. "Then you shouldn't have agreed to let me go." The silence that followed was heavy, but honest. Naira wasn't angry. She wasn't pleading. She was simply stating a truth that had been ignored for too long. "I love you Rowan said quietly. Nira believed him. But love, she had learned, was not enough. I love myself too, she replied. That conversation marked a turning point, not because it resolved anything, but because it clarified everything. Nira understood now that returning without change would mean disappearing again, and she had come too far to become invisible once more. Being sent away had taught her what staying never did, that self-worth doesn't require permission, that boundaries are not punishments, that love must be mutual, not managed. As night settled over the city, Nira felt a calm certainty take root. Whatever came next, she would no longer abandon herself to be chosen. Nira didn't rebuild her life all at once. She rebuilt it in quiet decisions. She chose to wake early, not because she had to, but because mornings felt like possibility now. She chose to walk instead of drive, to notice the rhythm of the city, to let her thoughts move without interruption. For the first time in years, her time belonged entirely to her. The absence of constant tension allowed clarity to surface. Nira noticed how often she had edited herself before, how she softened opinions, delayed needs, and waited for approval she never received. Now, she didn't wait. She volunteered regularly at a community center nearby, helping organize programs, listening to stories that reminded her how many people carried quiet struggles. No one there knew about her marriage. No one treated her differently. She was just Nira. That simplicity was healing. Romantic memories surfaced unexpectedly. A familiar song in a cafe, a couple laughing on the sidewalk. Moments that once made her smile now stirred reflection instead of pain. She didn't deny the love she had shared with Rowan. She honored it without letting it define her future. That balance, acknowledging love without clinging to it, felt like growth. Rowan reached out less frequently now. When he did, the conversations were respectful, careful, and unresolved. Nira no longer felt compelled to fill the gaps. She had learned that clarity often arrives when silence is allowed to speak fully. Education doesn't always arrive in classrooms. Sometimes it comes from solitude that teaches you who you are when no one is watching. Nira spent evenings reading, journaling, thinking about the kind of life she wanted, one that valued presence, protection, and mutual respect. She began to understand that love stories didn't fail because people stopped caring, but because they stopped choosing each other when it mattered. One afternoon, she received an invitation to a small gathering. Nothing formal, nothing strategic, just people coming together to share a meal. She hesitated only briefly before accepting. At the table, conversation flowed easily. Laughter was unguarded. No one assessed her worth based on appearance or association. Nira felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Belonging. Not the kind negotiated through performance, but the kind offered freely. That night, walking home beneath a sky softened by dusk, Nira realized something profound. She wasn't rebuilding from loss. She was rebuilding from truth. Truth had cost her comfort, but given her clarity. And clarity, she knew now, was worth protecting. The more Nira settled into her new life, the more she realized how much of herself she had once postponed. She no longer measured her days by messages she hoped to receive, or calls she expected might come. She measured them by how present she felt within them, by how often she laughed without restraint, by how rarely she felt the need to explain herself. Healing, she learned, wasn't loud. It was consistent. Nira began to recognize her own voice again, the one she had softened for the sake of harmony. She trusted her instincts now. When something felt misaligned, she didn't rationalize it away. She listened. Education often comes disguised as rediscovery. She reconnected with old interests that had quietly slipped away during her marriage. Writing became more than reflection. It became expression. Movement became more than exercise. It became grounding. Conversations became less about impression and more about connection. She noticed how easily she could breathe. Rowan's absence no longer felt like a wound. It felt like pace, not empty space, but intentional space. When Rowan eventually asked to meet, Nira agreed without urgency. They chose a neutral place, away from history and expectation. The conversation was calm, honest, and incomplete. "I see now how much I didn't protect you," Rowan said. Nira believed he meant it, but belief wasn't enough to undo patterns. "I needed you to choose me when it mattered," she replied, "not when it was convenient." Rowan nodded, absorbing the truth without defense. That was new, but Nira had learned something important during her time away. Growth acknowledged too late still carries consequences. They parted respectfully, without promises, without tension, without resolution. And for the first time, Nira didn't feel responsible for what came next. That night, she stood by her window again, watching the city move in quiet persistence. She realized she was no longer waiting for permission to move forward. She already had. Being sent away had given her distance. Distance had given her clarity. And clarity had given her freedom. Nira smiled, not because everything was fixed, but because she trusted herself to navigate whatever came next. The chapter closed not with loss, but with grounding certainty. She knew who she was, and she knew what she deserved. The mansion had never felt so large. Rowan noticed it first in the evenings, how sound traveled differently now, how footsteps echoed longer than they should. Rooms that once held quiet conversations and shared routines now felt staged, like spaces waiting for people who no longer arrived. Success surrounded him. Awards, recognition, influence. And yet, when the doors closed at night, none of it softened the stillness. Rowan sat alone in his office one evening, staring at a document he'd reviewed 3 times without absorbing a word. His mind drifted, not to work, but to moments he had dismissed as minor at the time. Nira standing quietly beside him at events. Nira waiting for him late at night. Nira asking questions he answered with reassurance instead of action. He realized something unsettling. She hadn't left suddenly. She had been leaving slowly for a long time, and he hadn't stopped her. Celeste moved through the house with her usual composure. She spoke of schedules, commitments, upcoming appearances. She seemed satisfied. Rowan wasn't. He noticed how often his mother spoke for him now, how decisions arrived fully formed, how alignment had replaced discussion. He had accepted it once because it felt efficient. Now it empty. One afternoon, Rowan declined an invitation he would have once accepted without question. Celeste noticed immediately. "You shouldn't distance yourself," she said calmly. "People are watching." Rowan looked at her. So was Nira. The room stilled. Celeste studied him carefully. "This isn't about sentiment." "No," Rowan replied quietly. "It's about consequence." That word lingered. Rowan began replaying moments with new clarity, not as isolated incidents, but as a pattern. Each pause, each hesitation, each time he chose peace over protection. He hadn't pushed Nira away. He had stepped aside and let it happen. Education often comes when the comfort of agreement disappears. Rowan felt the cost now. Not publicly, not professionally, personally. He returned home one evening to find the house exactly as he left it, orderly, polished, controlled, and unbearably quiet. He sat at the kitchen counter where Nira once rested her hand while waiting for him. The memory struck him harder than any argument ever had. Regret, he realized, wasn't loud. It was persistent, and it asked questions that couldn't be avoided anymore. Rowan began noticing what success had never taught him. No amount of structure could replace warmth. No amount of influence could substitute presence. The mansion remained flawless, but it no longer felt lived in. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was accusatory. Every room seemed to echo the same question. When did you stop protecting what mattered? He started arriving home earlier without meaning to. Not because his schedule demanded it, but because there was nowhere else he wanted to be. And yet, there was no one waiting. Celeste continued, as though nothing had changed. She spoke about upcoming engagements, strategic appearances, and long-term positioning. Her tone was calm, assured, confident that alignment had been achieved. Rowan listened differently now. Where he once heard guidance, he now heard control. Where he once felt relief, he now felt constraint. "You're distracted lately," Celeste observed one evening. Rowan didn't deny it. "I am." Celeste folded her hands. "You made the right choice. Time will confirm that." Rowan met her gaze. "Time already has." The certainty in his voice surprised even him. He thought back to the night Nira had asked him a simple question in the car. "If it comes down to choosing, what will you do?" He remembered how he avoided the answer, how he hoped circumstances would spare him from having to decide. They hadn't. Education often comes in retrospect. Rowan realized that by refusing to choose, he had chosen anyway. Agreement didn't require enthusiasm. Silence had done the work for him. He began to see how often Neera had adjusted herself to preserve harmony, how rarely he had done the same, how easily he had mistaken her patience for permanence. One evening, Rowan found a note tucked inside a book Neera had left behind, an old habit of hers. It wasn't meant for him. It was a fragment of reflection, written long before she left. Love needs protection to survive. The words felt heavier now. Rowan understood then that regret wasn't about losing Neera. It was about realizing he had failed to be the partner he believed himself to be. He reached for his phone more than once, then set it down again. Apologies felt insufficient without action. Promises felt hollow without proof. And for the first time, Rowan wasn't looking for forgiveness. He was looking for accountability. He knew what he had to do next wouldn't restore the past, wouldn't erase the damage, but it might finally acknowledge the truth. That loyalty delayed is often loyalty denied, and that some lessons arrive only after the cost has been paid. Rowan didn't announce his arrival. There was no dramatic call, no advance explanation, no attempt to soften the moment with prepared words. He simply showed up. Neera noticed him through the cafe window before he stepped inside. He stood across the street for a moment, adjusting his jacket, breathing as though he were steadying himself for something that couldn't be negotiated. She didn't feel her heart race. That surprised her. When Rowan entered, the room didn't shift the way it once did. There was no rush of memory, no sudden collapse of boundaries, just recognition. They greeted each other politely, like people who shared history but no longer lived inside it. Rowan waited until they were seated before speaking. "I shouldn't have taken this long," he said. Neera nodded once. "No, you shouldn't have." There was no bitterness in her voice, just truth. Rowan studied her carefully. She looked calmer than he remembered, grounded, not distant, but no longer reaching. "I didn't protect you," he continued. "I thought avoiding conflict would keep things stable. I was wrong." Neera listened without interrupting. He spoke slowly, deliberately, as though every word mattered now. He didn't mention his mother at first. He didn't deflect responsibility. He didn't justify his silence. "I agreed without saying yes," Rowan said, "and I didn't realize how damaging that would be until you were gone." Neera held his gaze. "I tried to you." "I know," Rowan replied. "I didn't hear you." That acknowledgement mattered more than any apology. There was a pause, not awkward, just honest. Neera finally spoke. "Do you know what hurt the most?" Rowan shook his head slightly. "It wasn't your mother's words," Naira said. "It was realizing you were willing to keep peace everywhere, except with me." Rowan closed his eyes briefly. "That's fair," he said. Nira noticed something else then, something new. He wasn't trying to persuade her. He wasn't trying to fix the moment. He was listening. Education often arrives when defensiveness ends. Rowan leaned forward. "I'm not here to ask you to come back. I'm here to tell you that I see what I did, and that I'm willing to face the consequences." Naira felt respect for him in that moment. Not affection, not hope, respect. "I'm glad you understand now," she said. "But understanding doesn't undo damage." "I know," Rowan replied. "I'm not asking it to." They sat in silence again. Outside, people passed by, unaware that a life had quietly shifted inside the cafe. Rowan finally asked, "Are you happy?" Nira considered the question. "I'm at peace," she said. "That matters more right now." Rowan nodded slowly, and for the first time, Naira saw the full weight of what he had lost. Not because she said it, but because he finally understood it. They didn't rush to fill the silence. That alone told Nira how much had changed. Rowan didn't look away this time. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't try to manage the moment. He simply sat with it, letting discomfort exist without trying to escape it. That used to be impossible for him. "I've been thinking about that night," Rowan said finally. "The night you asked me what I'd do if it came down to choosing." Nira's expression didn't change. "You never answered." "I didn't know how," Rowan admitted. "And instead of learning, I avoided it." Nira nodded slowly. Avoidance still answers the question. Rowan swallowed. Know that. Now, there was no defensiveness in his voice, no attempt to soften the truth, just acceptance. "I thought keeping everyone calm was leadership," he continued. "But I see now that leadership means taking a stand, even when it costs you something." Nira felt the weight of his words, but she didn't let them sway her. Growth acknowledged too late still had boundaries. "I needed you to choose me when it was uncomfortable," she said. "Not when the damage was already done." Rowan nodded again. "I understand." For a moment, Nira saw the man she once loved, the one who listened, who absorbed truth without turning away. But she also saw the man who had let fear decide for him. Both could be true. Rowan leaned back slightly. "If you don't come back," he said carefully, "I will respect that." Nira studied him. She believed him. "That's important," she replied, "because love without respect isn't love. It's attachment." Rowan exhaled, as if releasing something he'd been carrying for months. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I just didn't want to leave things unspoken." Nira appreciated that more than he knew. "I don't regret loving you," she said softly, "but I regret how small I became trying to make it work." Rowan looked at her then with something close to grief. "I never wanted that." "I know," Nira said, "but intention doesn't change impact." They sat quietly, letting the truth settle without argument. Outside, the light had shifted. Afternoon easing into evening. Time moving forward, whether they were ready or not. Rowan stood first. "Thank you for meeting me." Nira stood as well. "Thank you for listening." They didn't hug. They didn't promise anything. They simply acknowledged what was. As Rowan walked away, Nira felt no urge to follow. No ache to rewind the moment. Just a steady certainty in her chest. She had spoken her truth without anger. She had held her boundary without cruelty. And she knew, without doubt, that whatever came next would be chosen, not endured. Nira didn't feel lighter after the meeting with Rowan. She felt steadier. There was a difference. She understood now. Lightness faded. Stability stayed. She walked home that evening without rushing, letting the city move around her instead of through her. The air felt different, not because anything had changed externally, but because something inside her had settled. She no longer needed answers from Rowan. She had already given them to herself. Days passed quietly. Nira continued her routines, her work, her small acts of presence. People around her noticed the change, not because she spoke about it, but because she carried herself differently. She was no longer negotiating her worth. Rowan, meanwhile, returned to a house that felt even emptier than before. The clarity he'd gained didn't soften the absence. It sharpened it. Celeste noticed his withdrawal immediately. "You seem distant," she said. Rowan met her gaze evenly. "I am." Celeste frowned. "You're letting sentiment interfere with clarity." Rowan shook his head. "No, I'm finally understanding the cost of it." For the first time, Celeste didn't respond immediately. Rowan continued. "Family isn't about alignment. It's about protection. And I failed at that." Celeste's composure faltered slightly. Not in anger, but surprise. "You made a necessary decision," she said. Rowan replied calmly, "I made an easy one." The words landed between them, quiet but firm. Nira, unaware of this conversation, spent her evenings reflecting on what family meant to her now. Not by blood, not by obligation, by action. She thought of the people who had supported her without conditions, who had asked about her days without expecting performance, who had shown up without being asked. That, she realized, was family. Education often comes at the end of experience, not the beginning. Nira wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't waiting for apology or repair. She was simply choosing alignment with herself. And that choice felt like peace. Nira didn't return to the mansion, not because she couldn't, but because she didn't need to. The life she had rebuilt, quietly and intentionally, felt more real than anything she had left behind. It wasn't grand, wasn't polished, but it was honest. And honesty, she had learned, was where peace lived. She moved into a smaller place, closer to the community that had welcomed her without question. She kept mornings slow, evenings intentional. She filled her days with work that mattered to her, and people who saw her without trying to reshape her. Nira didn't define her future by what she lost. She defined it by what she refused to lose again. Rowan made changes, too. He distanced himself from the expectations that once guided his decisions. He spoke less about appearances and more about principles. He learned that leadership wasn't about avoiding conflict, but standing firm when it mattered. But growth, Nira understood, didn't entitle anyone to a second chance. It simply meant the lesson had finally been learned. Celeste's world grew quieter. Control had once given her certainty, but without someone to direct, it lost its power. Influence without connection faded quickly. Loneliness, she discovered, was the price of dominance. Nira reflected often on the word family, how easily it had been used as leverage, and how deeply it had been misunderstood. Family wasn't the people who claimed you when it benefited them. It was the people who stood with you when standing cost them something. Love, she learned, wasn't proven by promises or patience alone. It was proven by protection, by advocacy, by choosing someone, not when it was convenient, but when it was uncomfortable. Nira smiled more now, not because everything had worked out perfectly, but because she trusted herself to recognize when love was real. She had learned to set boundaries without guilt, to walk away without bitterness, and to honor her worth without apology. Sometimes being sent away isn't rejection. It's redirection. And sometimes losing a family is how you discover your own. Nira closed her journal one evening and looked out at the city lights, calm settling into her chest like certainty. She was home. If this story reminded you that love should protect you, not shrink you, take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear that choosing yourself is not selfish. And subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson for more stories that don't just entertain, but teach us how to love with dignity and self-worth.